horse is a symbol not only of the American West, but of America itself. Over the last 100 years, the population of wild horses in America has dropped from roughly 2 million down to less than 30,000. And if something doesn't change, many believe these amazing creatures will soon disappear forever.
I just think it's important you take care of your horses.
We've got ranchers and we've got oil drillers, and the horses are what get sacrificed when it comes to the land.
Imagine if you're married, you have your wife and your family, and you're rounded up and you're pushed into these pens. They take your wife and throw you in a pen with a bunch of other young, aggressive males.
Despite the love and respect so many people feel for these national treasures, the future of wild horses on this continent is in jeopardy. Many people believe this is the result of years of mismanagement, compounded by threats from recent legislation.
You know, the wild horses belong to all of us. It's not just the federal government.
The Bureau of Land Management, it's a federal agency that oversees public lands in the American West.
The BLM owns about 280 million acres in states like New Mexico, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Nevada. The BLM is the dominant landholder.
Some of it's used for extractive industries, some of it's used for recreation.
And also, the Bureau of Land Management is in charge of protecting wild horses.
Organized roundups or gathers, generally conducted from trucks or helicopters, play a central role in the BLM's management of wild horses. Many people have grown critical of the way the BLM conducts these gathers.
There's nothing I've ever seen more destructive than a wild horse roundup.
You start out as slow, and you actually do a lot of herding. You locate them and drift them towards your trap.
The males are driven into corrals on the left and the females on the right.
When we gather horses, we're putting back some of the best quality. We're trying to improve the herds.
They're auctioning the best horses off, where they should be leaving a percentage of them. And anything that's adoptable, they're taking.
These horses have families. Let them stay together, like people.
The idea of them being imprisoned in one way or another for the rest of their lives is like taking us out of our homes and putting us in a concentration camp. It's horrible.
My mother, who grew up in Romania, she said, "So what happens after the horses are caught?" And I said, "Well, they go to these holding facilities and they're processed." She said, "It's just like the camps."
We've heard all kinds of stories that they're being fattened up to go to slaughter.
What do you think of H.R. 503 and S. 311, which is the American Horse Slaughter Prevention Act?
I'm not going to comment on that.
It's a sick, insidious document. It includes the destruction of healthy animals, burning them in burial pits.
They're planning to, what they call euthanize, over 30,000 wild horses.
Euthanize is a very nice word for saying we're going to slaughter them. We're just going to kill these horses.
For decades, beginning in 1971, American wild horses were protected under the Wild Free-Roaming Horse and Burro Act.
Very recently, without a hearing or an opportunity for public review, Senator Conrad Burns from Montana snuck a rider into the 2005 federal appropriations bill.
The Burns bill, which became law on December 8, 2004, made it much easier to sell horses to be slaughtered for human consumption.
The new appointees come in with a different attitude, but the infrastructure that's there is basically Bush's infrastructure.
The very notion that the wild American horses will be slaughtered as a food source for foreign gourmets has struck a chord with the American people.
The Burns Amendment, I think, was put in place to help remove this, big glut of horses that we have in holding facilities right now.
There was no reason to pass the Burns bill, save for the fact that it helps the BLM avoid managing these horses.
A growing uproar over the U.S. government's deadly wild horse roundup in Nevada. Why is the U.S. government so hell-bent on getting these horses off public land?
The activity in the region is massive. Gas, uranium, coal.
There's a $3 billion 700-mile pipeline that will purportedly transport natural gas from Wyoming to Oregon.
It has obvious implications not only for wild horses, but also for other kinds of wildlife.
There's probably a real feeling that they don't really have to enforce things as far as the wild horses go. That's why you see these horses going across the border into Mexico for slaughter. There's just too much evidence there that tells you in your gut, they're not doing their job.
These horses will be butchered and sent to places like France, where they will be eaten in expensive restaurants.
Santa Teresa is New Mexico's largest livestock port of entry and exports no other animals into Mexico except slaughter-bound horses.
What's happening to our wild horses when they go to these long-term holding facilities? Are they slipping out the back door to slaughter?
Many horse advocates fear that without this federal protection, there will be no future for this priceless part of our American heritage.
If any of these politicians visited these sites where our indigenous animals are being slaughtered in an inhumane way and being sold for meat, I feel like there would be a different approach to what's happening.
We need to remind Americans that the public land is our land and should not be sold to the highest bidder.
It's about the survival of the American West as we know it.
If you believe in change for America, then believe in change for America's wild horses.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I think that if we don't do something, that there's going to be somewhat of a new kind of revolution in the West where people are going to stand up for the rights, protect the quality of life, protect the things that make the West special.
I spent the 60s at the University of Wisconsin, and I'm no stranger to civil disobedience.
These are living things who have a right to coexist. Let's do something about this.
I mean, they basically represent the spirit of the Americas in a way that we can only begin to understand.
What's at stake is the future of this country. Simple as that.
It's a symbol, I think, of our freedom. It's a symbol of the cowboys' freedom. It's a symbol of that we pretty much look at America and think, well, hell, we're free. And the horse looks like he's probably a little more free than we are.
If we can't find room in our society to do whatever it takes to keep the wild horse from going to slaughter, I mean, that's really telling. It's an indictment against our society and our way of life.
I'm hoping that man will save the horse, because in so many instances the horse has saved the man.
It's just hard to believe that they want to euthanize these creatures.
The horses are in a battle out here for their survival. They're literally making their last stand.
If the public could view what was being done to wild horses, the public would stand up and take action.
They have been and they are managing wild horses to extinction.
These animals are so important. They tie us to our history, they are part of our heritage, and they have no one to protect them other than us. So please act.
Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay. What'd you think of that? And I'm going to do this. And are you on the phone? Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, and you talk a little louder too because this phone system isn't that good.
Okay, how's this?
That's good. Okay, folks, we are on the phone with John Cox, and he's an investigative journalist. And he's going to explain the corruption of BLM. Explain what kind of research. First of all, I think we want to go to your blog, don't we? This is John Cox's blog site, and you've done an amazing amount of work, and anyone can go there. It's photojournalist.
In 2007, the USA...
No, it's veteran journalist.
Yeah, it's veteran journalist, excuse me.
Veteran-journalist.com.
Yeah, veteran-journalist.com. But on your blog site, it says photojournalist-journalist. So kind of confusing for the viewers.
Well, yeah, that's the difference between the internet site and the actual name of the... I am a photojournalist. I was.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to give the blog site there. That's his blog site. And why don't you tell us, John, what kind of information, proof do you have that our wild horses are still going to slaughter after the Office of Investigative General's Office came out with the report that 1,700 wild horses were sent to slaughter illegally by the BLM, and I guess is it Sally Jewell, not Sally Jewell, what's her name that still runs, Sally Spencer, is it?
I believe so.
Sally Spencer was the one who illegally sent these horses to slaughter, and she's still employed by the BLM. So why don't you tell us, how does the BLM get away with it right now? What are they doing? They're rounding up the horses, and then what do they do?
Well, here's the problem. Yes, they are getting away with the situation of stealing horses. And we find through different undercover operations that happened in the mid-'90s, horses led to slaughter, anatomy of a cover-up, can be looked up. You can Google that or look it up somehow on the internet. But yes, there is no doubt that the BLM is doing illegal activity. Their environmental assessments are pretty shady. There's a lot of false and misinformation within all of their environmental assessments. And then we started to notice that they were not signing the environmental assessments. So nobody was taking responsibility for the actual roundups taking place. They go unsigned because they know there's falsified information in there. So that cued us to the situation of we heard about how they inventoried the horses in order to pay private contractors to either bait and trap the horses out in the field or to round them up by helicopter. So we centered on Murders Creek in the state of Oregon. What we found was, there was basically, right from the get-go, there was 33 dead horses that they inventoried, that the taxpayers paid for within the bait and trap movement.
And how much did the taxpayers pay?
$33,000 for those 33 horses.
Can you believe
what
that?
We found with the significant thing here with the inventory is that we can go from point A, the trap site where the horses were trapped or flushed into the trap site. We can go to point B, which would be Burns, Oregon, which would be the closest holding facility and corrals. And then we can go to point C, D, E, and F because we can follow those inventories and the transportation when they were picked up, when they were delivered at these other sites. What we found with the 33 dead horses, of course, and how we detected that is that they never made it to Burns Corral. They weren't even rounded up and loaded onto the trailers. They had marked down that they captured, ate, and trapped 33 wild horses that were basically dead in the field. We can only assume. What we can conjecture is that those 33 horses were bait and trapped, loaded onto a kill buyer's trailer, and sent to slaughter immediately. And they just listed them as dead. That's the normal situation they do.
Well, now, I just want to interrupt you here because I have right on the screen there, contact Congressman Adderholt. He is the chairman of the Ag Appropriations Committee in the House, a very powerful congressman who is from Alabama, and he, in my opinion, is I have no words to describe this man. He is very pro-slaughter. He wants to bring horse slaughter back to the United States and reopen these plants. And he needs to be contacted by the public because he is being supported by the industries, the meat industries. You can go to opensecrets.org and you can see all the information of all the Congress people and where they get their funding. And this man, this very powerful congressman, needs to be contacted by the public so that he knows there's a spotlight on him on how he's handling our wild horses, because this man does nothing to save our wild horses, and he's a very, very adamant person for horse slaughter and making a business out of it back in America. So I just had to say that. So what you're saying feeds in right away with the corruption that's going on and the fact that there is these broken records that you have been able to prove that these horses are not going where they're supposed to go.
Well, it's not that the records are broken. Quite frankly, those inventory sheets are done rather well because they are so complete. So we can take Murder's Creek, for example, and we can use the number 33 because those are the horses that were dead there, and then we can go through just say Nevada, Oregon, Idaho, California, Wyoming, and we can look at those inventory sheets, and we can also track the horses. But the odd thing is that we found close to $3.2 million worth of dead horses on those inventory sheets within a 2-year time period.
In other words, you're saying that they were saying they were dead, but there was no real proof of that?
Well, okay, let's go back to point A, the trap site, for example, or the roundup site. Point B being the holding corral nearest to the roundup. Point C being where they transitioned from a holding corral to either a temporary holding corral or a long-term holding corral. So we find some of those horses got to point C, for example, to go to a temporary or permanent holding corral, and after that simply disappeared. They dropped off the inventory system. So we can only assume that 1,700 that you mentioned earlier, and probably many more, well, $3.2 million worth, that disappeared via that, just by their inventory sheets alone. Now, keep in mind that these private contractors were paid very handsomely at anywhere from $1,000 to $1,200 per horse to round up or to bait and trap. So this is where we come up with the, for example, $33,000 or the $3.2 million. So we have a definitive situation here. These are, you can't mess with the numbers. It's like good science. There are certain laws that you abide by. Well, the laws of mathematics says that these horses have disappeared from inventory. Some were listed as dead and that kind of thing, but we're pretty hesitant in the fact that they were dead at all, and all of a sudden they disappear from the inventory in total. So we have a lot of questions.
And how many? Excuse me, but how many horses did they say on the inventory sheet were dead?
Well, you whatever the 3.2 million number is, but in Murder's Creek, for example, we can use that as the microcosm, and there were 33 they stated were dead. Now, I interviewed, I believe his name was Rob Sharp. I don't have the names in front of me now, but he's the supervisor out at the Burns facility in Oregon. That's where the Murder's Creek horses would go. He denied vehemently that the inventory sheet even said that, and I even pointed out the fact that, well, we FOIA'd this information and it's time-stamped on the back of the sheet here, and he insisted that he didn't know anything about it. So we went and questioned the lady that was out on the site as well, and she was in charge of loading the horses onto the trailer. And we asked her, are you inventorying dead horses? And she said, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. And I just told her, well, just answer it truthfully. And she said, well, as far as she's concerned, she didn't inventory any dead horses. So she didn't really know what I was talking about. Of course, it's the old, well, I don't know, type situation. So
now hold on, John. I just want to interject here. On the screen is Senator Cantwell's number. That's the switchboard, folks, and she is the chairperson, the ranking chair member, or ranking committee member of the Senate Natural Resources Committee, and that's a committee, very powerful committee, where Senator Cantwell could instigate an investigation and into a head count of all of our BLM horses and where they're going with our tax dollars. And I have contacted her several times, and she refuses to even go there with me, to even answer. I've had deadline after deadline. So even though I've been able to talk to her aides just mentioned briefly that Senator Cantwell was being lobbied very heavily by the Yakima tribe there in Washington, and that's why she doesn't support the SAFE Act. And so this is exactly why it's so important that people call and tell her that we're watching her and we're going to vote for the people who are going to protect our public lands and are going to investigate BLM and literally remove BLM from the wild horse program because they're totally corrupt. They've been already proven to be so with the 1,700 wild horses, and in that report the OIG states that they suspect thousands more have gone to slaughter. So having said that, continue what you're saying.
Well, let's go back to the undercover investigation. The horses led to slaughter, the anatomy of a cover-up in the mid-1990s. And we discover, for example, an agent is interviewing a informant. And there's several informants in that undercover investigation. This is just one of many that are saying the same thing. And he asked, do you feel like there's people inside the BLM that knew about this practice, that are a part of this practice of stealing horses and sending them to slaughter? His response was immediate because we also had access to the tapes. And he said, sure, we can't operate unless they're standing there. So we kind of have the smoking gun with the inventory sheets. And this is interesting because they wish that they didn't have any kind of inventory that we could track at all. But as I said, they're very clear. They go from point A to point B to C and D. And now, when we can deviate from the dead horses as well, we can find live horses that suddenly drop off the inventory sheet as well. Say in Fernley, Nevada, where we know that there's a transfer site, and we know that many horses that have gone to slaughter and headed up to both Canada and down to Mexico have been transferred to different kill buyer trucks in Fernley. There's a livestock yard there right in the middle of Fernley, and we used to have witnesses that would tell us about, well, yeah, a couple of 3 trucks came in today and they transferred horses. Well, they don't wind up to where they're going. That's where they drop off the inventory sheet. So.
You mean now that's where all of a sudden the inventory sheet of BLM, what? It doesn't say where they're going, or what?
Well, what those particular horses had was, let's see, I don't know if I can, the name of the town where the Litchfield, I think I pronounced that right, and I think it's in southern Oregon or northern California there by the Oregon border. That's the same thing as the Burns facility. It's a facility where they hold wild horses. Now we can trace some of those horses to Litchfield, and then see from counts in their inventory sheets that they're lacking these, say 12 horses, for example. Well, they never received these 12 horses, but the inventory sheet shows that these 12 horses went on, for example, July 12th, that we're seeing on July 13th, the inventory to Litchfield doesn't have those 12 horses. So that's kind of the smoking gun as well.
Right, and I want to interject here again. I have on the screen that 600 meat inspectors have been laid off due to budget cuts. And Adderholt is very much responsible for that because he's, the chairman, a very powerful chairman on the ag appropriations. So these budget cuts for protecting Americans from foodborne illnesses, 600 meat inspectors are laid off, while millions are spent on rounding up wild horses to feed an industry in a foreign market. And so it's very important for people to understand, that their money is being used in this criminal fashion. And these are criminals. These Congress people, in my opinion, are criminals that are not doing their job and shouldn't even be where they are. And unless people wake up, it's all going to come back in diseases for the public, as well as we're not going to have any wild horses left at all.
But
So,
there's another significant situation here, and I can raise 2 points real quickly, is the fact that misinformation to the public, given by BLM employees to the public, is a federal felony, and it goes up to 15 years in prison. So this is a very serious situation, and it's not taken lightly. But for some reason, the BLM has been able to not be charged with this felony situation.
right.
So that's interesting in itself.
Well, that's what I say to the public, is that the wild horses are America, and they are also the messengers, the spiritual messengers to us, the American people, because we love them so much, and they rode us through history on their backs. I mean, we wouldn't be where we are today if it weren't for the horse. And so their message in this corruption is telling us exactly how corrupt this government is. And it is so rotten. And the judges, in my opinion, also are just, completely complacent and go along with BLM. I know my own experience of having a lawsuit against BLM. I know from that how that lawsuit went. So you go to court and you present your case and you know it's right. And in our case, it was Triple B in Nevada, and we could prove that the horses weren't given enough land forage, and the cattle were giving, and the livestock were given more. And that was our bone of contention in court. And the judge just totally kind of circumvented that whole thing thing that we were in court for, and just said, sided with BLM. So that's the corruption that goes on. And I think the American people are very aware of this now. So what can the American people do? Number one is, what's very important is to contact these people like Congressman Adderholt and shine a spotlight on him. Let him know that the American people are watching every move he makes. And why isn't he supporting an investigation into BLM with our, and to make sure that the BLM isn't stealing more of our tax dollars, because the 1,700 wild horses that were sent to slaughter cost the American taxpayer $140,000 according to the OIG report. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So, like you said, 3.5 million are also, how did you come to that figure?
Well, we also look at the payroll vouchers of what the private contractors had received directly involving the inventory sheets. So we covered the whole realm of the paperwork that's included, the all-inclusive situation of the roundups of the bait and trap methodology and that kind of thing. And we found that, and we've seen what the cost was per horse. So we would take that roundup and then go ahead and figure out, $1,000 per head or $950 per head or whatever. And the brains of the bunch in our group would come up with this $3.2 million just on the inventory sheets that we had for the 2 years.
Wow.
And we didn't have, now keep in mind that we didn't have all of the inventory sheets. They stopped sending us the inventory sheets and refused the FOIAs once they found out what we were doing with them.
Mm-hmm.
So they also transferred the logging and the journalizing of the inventory sheets from Colorado to Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
Now, keep in mind, again, the other point that I was going to bring up a little while ago, that this undercover operation, that not to be of a cover-up, those people all had federal warrants issued for their arrest for straight-up felonies. I think there was about 1,245 or 1,250 BLM employees. Now, that whole investigation was called off the night before they issued those arrest warrants. So what you have to keep in mind is that those people from the mid-'90s moved up into the administrative levels of BLM. They didn't get fired. Nobody was fired.
No, and that's what I mean about the corruption. Sally Spencer
Exactly.
is the one who is responsible for illegally selling these 1,700 wild horses to a no-and-kill buyer, and she's still there. She's not fired. So if people can get outraged about this enough and literally boycott all beef that's being grown and raised on public lands, folks. That's super important, because if you go to Whole Foods where they have this little pamphlet that says panorama meats and how great they are with the ecology, well, I thought, oh great, at least I can tell my viewers that they can go to Whole Foods and get meat that's been grown on private ranchers' lands. And I called Panorama Meats, and I said, okay, who are the ranchers that I can recommend to my viewers? And they said, well, we really can't give you any kind of names, because all the private ranchers along with the public ranchers, it all goes to, the cattle go to the same slaughter plant. And therefore, we can't really keep records. And I said, well, that doesn't make sense, because each individual rancher is getting paid for the meat that they're getting slaughtered there. So you must have some kind of record. And they refused to give it. And right there, I knew that it was just, Whole Foods, a sham again to sell meat and make it look like it's good. And they've been doing this with GMOs, saying that they don't sell GMOs when they do. And the Health Ranger, you can go on YouTube and see the Health Ranger's report on that. So I'm telling everyone, I'm glad that Whole Foods is now, losing stores, because the public's getting fed up with what they're doing.
Well, there's something else that goes with that, in the fact that cattle, with their grazing permits, of course, they overgraze cattle on public lands, but they also sublease, which is also a felony, a federal felony for those people that hold grazing permits to sublease that land to other cattle ranchers, which the BLM ignores. But here's the problem. We have grasslands have been depleted to such a point, we only have about 2% of the grasslands left. And that's the whole food that they're talking about, is that they can go and graze on these grasses, but the problem is those grasses don't exist anymore. So what they have to do is pump the cattle full of steroids. And even though they're grazing on public lands, the grass just isn't there.
Yeah.
So we're getting the steroids the same as commercial, beef and that kind of thing. But we're talking about, they want to make that beef above normal, but yet it's not. It's the same type of steroids, the same type of pasturing that the commercial beef use. So that's kind of misinformation as well. And it kind of leads people to believe one thing, but yet the truth is an entirely different situation. So.
Well, now, folks, you're seeing John Cox's site here, and it's his blog. It has all kinds of incredible information. I cannot believe how much work you have done in trying to save our wild horses. I have to commend you. What an amazing person you are, and the work that you have done, and the work that your fellow people that are involved in exposing this corruption. So I advise everyone to go and visit his site, and his blog site is right there on the screen, and it proves to you the corruption. It's just amazing. So having said that, you were talking about grassland. Now in the Teo, I was reading the Teo the other day, little booklet, and you know what it says? It says when the horses are led to the fields to fertilize the land, that means the world is living in Teo. When the horses are being bred for war in the suburbs, that means the world is out of sync with Teo. And isn't that appropriate for what you're explaining to the public?
Yes, it is, because when you consider that an ecological system is balanced by a diversity of wildlife, and that includes the apex predators all the way down to squirrels, to mice, to field mice, to sage grouse, to whatever, crows, different birds, and it also includes wild horses. It includes the bivalve or the hoofed animal that is the carrier of a lot of seeds and that kind of thing. What it doesn't include are non-indigenous species like cattle. It can't, because cattle are very destructive to land. So what has happened is with
John, can you explain how they're destructive? A lot of the public doesn't understand why the cattle are so destructive and the horses are not.
Well, the horses have teeth that are above and below. In other words, lower jawline teeth, upper jawline teeth, for example. And this is the kind of the premise that we go by. Cattle have a plate, and then on the lower segment they have the teeth. So what they do is not only are they very heavy animals with extremely large hoof, but when they eat, they rip the grasses and that kind of thing out by the roots. Horses, if you observe the horses, you'll find that they gnaw the grass to the upper level, and then their whiskers, their chin whiskers and that kind of thing, tell them that they can only go down so far, and they don't go into the dirt itself most often.
Mm-hmm. So, I've seen that with my own horse. He'll crop, but he won't tear out. Very seldom, once in a while, if the earth is really loose, he'll get a chunk, but that's very rare.
Mm-hmm. So the cattle will pretty much grab and tighten that grass against within their mouth, that kind of thing, since they only have one row of teeth, and just go ahead and pull up. But they love the roots too, and the bulbs and different things, where horses don't necessarily eat those same types of grasses. So that's kind of a misinformation outlet as well. When we sit there and say that or when the BLM, I should say that the wild horses are in competition directly with the cattle grasses and that kind of thing, that's not true, because they eat two different types of species of grass out there in our public lands. So.
But I mean, horses do sort of eat all kinds of different varieties of grasses and brush and all that. So I mean, in all fairness, we do have to say, I'm sure that when they come across something that the cattle are eating, they're going to eat that too. But they're not going to tear it out. They're not going to tear it out by the roots like the cattle, but I know my horse, he eats all kinds of different species of grasses and things like that, you know.
Well, then we'd have to talk to a biologist, which brings up another key point. What the BLM is, in a lot of different aspects, when they do the horse counts or when they do the plea for overpopulation and they need PZP for this or that or whatever. Well, the figures that they're coming up with are biologically impossible. Well, they're biologically impossible because, number one, the BLM would like us to believe that horses lived forever. So they just assimilate their numbers into 20 to 35% per year, and they don't take into consideration full death, which is about, from our observations and being in the field in a boots-on-the-ground type situations on a yearly basis, we're out there almost all the time, and we see the full rates at least 50%. Sometimes it might drop to 48 in some areas, but we're seeing more of a 54 to 58% as well. And these are just full birth rates of death.
What does that mean? What does that mean? You mean out of 50 out of 100 foals, only 50 lived?
Yes.
Okay.
And that.
What do they die of? What do they die of?
Well, they die of birth. There's problems at birth. There's physical problems. At the advent of the PZP, we're finding more problems with younger horses being impregnated.
Now, what's PZP?
Well,
I want to talk about. I want to talk about that, and I want to talk. We only have 10 minutes left, but I want to talk about the Humane Society's role in destroying our wild horses, because that's what they're doing.
Well, their role is that they're pushing this pesticide PZP, and it's registered as a pesticide within the Environmental Protection Agency. Mm-hmm. So we have to keep that in mind when we're talking about some of these things. Mm-hmm. And the fact is that there was a trade-off given, that there was no research done on the effects of this pesticide PZP in the wilderness areas. Mm-hmm. That's why we objectify the situation of the pesticide PZP, because they leave out the variables. And the variables, what I was just talking about within the birth rate of, say, horses, or even we're led to believe that the horses just don't die on public lands. They just live forever. Well, that's a biological impossibility as well. So, and we go and we ask, well, why is this? Why would they expect us to believe this? And then we go to the research that was done on the pesticide PZP, and we find it very subjective. Subjective is not a good science. Objectivity.
Well, I mean, hold on. I just got to backtrack here. How does this key into Humane Society of the United States? Because I want to explain to people that the Humane Society of the United States, in the beginning, went along with BLM saying that these horses are overpopulated and need to be removed. I got a all animals bulletin from them where they were saying, oh, it's a very big problem that these horses are overpopulated, and what are we going to do about it? So that was several years ago that I got that bulletin. And so to me, that was a misinformation to the public that these horses were overpopulated, and the Humane Society is the biggest animal rights advocates organization, and people are giving millions of dollars to this organization, and they literally, in my opinion, are destroying our wild horse herds. And I asked them if they ever went out there and did an independent count aside from BLM, and they didn't. They never did. They just assumed that BLM was telling the truth. And so that put my alert system up that this organization was making money off the sympathy of their members. And so how do they tie into the PZP?
When we discuss variables, say the variable of the 50% death rate of foals during birth doesn't exist in their numbers. The death of horses, if a horse got stuck between their hoofs, stuck between a rock and a cliff or whatever, and it broke its leg and it couldn't go obtain its own food, it dies. They never took that into any kind of variability at all. Mm-hmm. So when we look at science, there's certain laws of science that do exist. What the researchers had done with the pesticide PZP is they refrained from putting any variables, like I just explained, or the variables of doing research and admitting if they did research at all in the wilds, what were some of the actions or reactions of other animals that ate the dead carcass of a PZP'd horse or whatever. We don't know because it's not included in their research. So those are significant variables.
Right.
And so we can also find, I don't know, that we can go on with this. This could be an entire show for you, actually. But the fact is that what that did was open the door to the false overpopulation figures and that kind of thing. Opens the door to, and this is where people are going to cringe and that kind of thing, because it opens the door to experimentation of wild horses. That's what's going on now. We have not just the HSUS, which is the Humane Society of America, which is separate from the local organizations. That's something that's very significant to understand. You donate to the local organization of the Humane Society, and the money goes to the animals. You donate to the Humane Society of the United States, and the money goes into the pockets of traveling expense for some of these people in the HSUS living pretty large lives. But now we get to the experimentation phase, and we find that Return to Freedom and some of the other large nonprofit groups, along with the HSUS, are experimenting with our horses, and they're obtaining millions of dollars in grants from the Bureau of Land Management, the Department of Interior, and some human health organizations. So we're starting to see some kind of unethical behavior. It had already been happening, but now it's starting to develop at even a more aggressive rate. So that's bothersome in itself as well. And yet we can go back, and that's why they admit they make millions of dollars in grants and that kind of thing. They have to get along with the BLM to do that. So they have to admit that, well, by golly, there is an overpopulation of wild horses. How about that? Well,
yeah.
We don't see that. We don't find that at all. What we have found is the BLM in Nevada, for example, rounding up horses and steering them over to near, say, right outside of Las Vegas or right outside of Carson or right outside of Reno, where people can actually see them. So they've taken them from their remote areas where nobody sees them at all, and they've brought them in to where people, see that big crowd of wild horses around that pond? Well, they basically rounded them up and gathered them around that pond for the public to see. So we're being led, falsely, I might add, within a lot of different directions in regard to this wild horse situation. And the confusion and deceptions are tremendous. Just
well,
very,
it is.
Very much so.
It is. And I've got on the screen now, folks, to contact your Congress member. That's the switchboard number, and say you want them to support the Safeguard America's Food Export Act.
No, wait a minute now.
But when you contact your Congress member, and it's a little bit complicated here, the Safeguard America's Food Export Act states very simply that horses cannot be used as food because of the unhealthy aspects of the horse meat, and they cannot be slaughtered here in the United States for food, and they cannot also be transported to foreign countries so that they can be slaughtered there for food. Now, on the site, and I'm at this site right now, and it's hard for you to see, but this is the American Wild Horse Campaign, and Susan Roy has some real reservations about this act because she's saying, and I'm quoting here, Roy said the provisions against slaughtering horses for commercial purposes are well intended, but have loopholes that open a back door big enough to drive a slaughter truck through. In other words, there is no enforcement mechanism, no requirement for transparency, and no penalty for violating the prohibitions on slaughtering and killing. And that's a very good point, because what they should have in this act is that anyone caught selling wild horses, or not just wild horses, but any horses in the United States for slaughter, or bringing them over to another country to be slaughtered, there's a $100,000 fine. And then that fine goes to a money pool where citizen and horse advocates can literally tap into that money pool and become investigative journalists and make sure that the act is being upheld. So that's what you need to say to your congressperson, is that you want them to support the SAFE Act, but make sure that there's some kind of provisions, and what provisions are there, and hold them to the fire. Don't just say, yes, I want you to co-sponsor this act, and like that. Say, I don't see there's any, what are the penalties? And thank them for, if they are co-sponsoring that act, thank them for doing so, but that you're very concerned about what the penalties are going to be. And so that's very important, folks, to do that. So let's go back now to John Cox, having said that. And do you have anything more to say? Because, John, we've got about 9 minutes left. And so, John, in your, what other things would you like the public to know? I know we were discussing how horses do not harm the environment. And would you talk about the population issue and how misdirected and misinformed the American public are on that issue? What are your findings?
Well, it's not just me. It's when I publish something or do a blog, I have probably about 12 to 15 people backing me up in regard to the research, the investigation. We're in a lot of places, a lot of times setting up trail cams. We're observing wild horse herds from mountaintops, plateaus, in the woods. We literally have to go through the trees because their helicopter counts are totally inept, and because of the top cover of the trees. So we're down there actually. For example, I can use a Poyama outside of Klamath Falls, Oregon, and outside of Keno, Oregon, as a good example. There used to be two bands over there outside of the Poyama HMA. One band had 8 and the other had, I believe, 14. And what we find now is absolutely zero. Now, when these two bands existed, for some reason, the Klamath Falls BLM office was doing a count of 312 and 318 horses. Where they got those, I have no idea. But what we did find on the ground is that some of the supposed wild horses had nail holes in the hooves, and they had saddle sores. So we, no doubt, have the situation where they're counting horses that have been dropped off in the wilds. We have an ethical question about that. The BLM actually
That's
and we have a
amazing.
lot of other things that have developed in regard to the actual count. We're asking a lot of people who are driving through or nearby the Poyama HMA to please give us a call, and we have a list of numbers to call off of the Facebook site, off the Twitter site at the time. I don't have that material in front of me right now, but we're asking them to please give us a call if you see any of these Poyama horses, because we're not finding any. So, but yet they're making a budget to round up, I believe, 320 horses.
So how?
Their figures show, you know, the 20% per year, and they're to once again to 320, but they just aren't there. We can't find them.
Okay, and what's interesting is people will say, well, then how can they round up 320 horses if they aren't there? But that's the way BLM steals our money, is they say, well, we're going to go round up, 320 horses, and that's going to cost the taxpayer, I don't know how many thousands of dollars. I guess Couture gets $360 per horse they round up, and that's just, he's the helicopter.
They get $1,000 per horse just on the bait trap. So the roundup with helicopters is even more. I think it's about $1,200.
Yeah. See, so
about 300. At 320, we're talking about $320,000 of tax.
So.
And then how are they going to register them with on the inventory sheets? That's something else that we don't have access to anymore. So right now, the transparency of the BLM is zero. If you've noticed, and this is another interesting point, is that they've taken a majority of their internet sites off. They have one main site for the BLM, but the field offices, the majority of them have been taken off the internet.
All right. Well, we are coming to the end now of our program, so I'm asking folks to please contact your Congress members and Senator Cantwell and ask for an investigation into BLM's head count of their horses and the theft of our horses, our wild horses. We want our wild horses returned, the 50,000 in holding. We want them returned to their herd areas, and we want, that's what we want, and that's what we have to keep asking for. So, having said that, John, I'll give you the last 4 minutes of what people can do and how we can support you. How can we support what you're doing with your camcorders out there and, out in the field?
Well, we're spending a lot of time observing horses, too. So a lot of us know horses inside and out. We all own horses as well. But the biggest thing that people can do now is please stop donating to the organizations that do such things as support the BLM in whatever endeavors that they think is going to save horses, because the BLM is not in the business of saving horses. So if there's a nonprofit that's supporting BLM, please don't donate to them, because that just confuses the issue more. The deceptions roll in, and the fact is that you can't work within corruption and not be corrupt.
Boy.
We found that out through history many times over.
Now we're running out of time, so you got a couple of seconds. That's a very good point. And you can find out if they want to PZP the horses. That group is just not going along in a good way.
Exactly. I would say just pay attention and please read more in regard to what's going on with the wild horses, and don't accept if something looks sour or it looks like misinformation, or you're going, well, that's hard to believe.
Well, we got to go. So, unfortunately, I got to cut it short. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching, and please help the horses.